the US actually has an opportunity, and Trump has a big enough ego that he has a cheat code in front of him. Historically, governments, their fiat currencies always go to zero because of hyperinflation. And that's the trajectory of the US dollar. As big and as powerful as the US dollar is, but the only three options governments ever take 100% of the time is they hyperinflate their currency. That's the only way they can kind of pay off their debt. There's now a fourth option, and the US is the only country that can do it. The US government could print $10 trillion, and that actually wouldn't do that much to the US dollar. But $10 trillion going into Bitcoin would outpace, Bitcoin would appreciate at a faster rate than the US dollar would inflate. And so there's a cheat code in front of us. Trump could actually pay off the US debt by buying Bitcoin. It's the only time in history this could ever happen. And I think Trump's crazy enough and self-indulgent enough to want this for his legacy. And I actually think that's the path forward.
Brother Brian, so great to see you again. Thank you so much. I'm going to show everyone else Bitcoin Evangelism. You sent me this book. It was the first print. I'm 7 of 125. So this book I've read many fantastic books on Bitcoin, and some of them would be more theoretical. Some would be more practical. Some would do more comparisons, gold versus Bitcoin. Everyone takes a different angle. Some would be more freedom for the people. I felt like your book as a standalone covered every single angle. So it was absolutely awesome. So I just want to recommend everyone check that out. And it's one of those things where right now Bitcoin's a hot topic. We're recording this. Bitcoin's just under like high 90s, just the all-time highs today. So it's a hot topic. But you've been investing in this space for a decade, and you're an entrepreneur, Jiujitsu Blackbelt, family man, just a great guy. So I love talking to you because it's a lot more than just Bitcoin and crypto and investing. It's about all these other things too, which we're going to talk about.
Yeah, man. Well, we were already having a good conversation offline before, and that always makes for the most fun interview. So yes, thanks for the shout out. You got the 7th ever copy of Bitcoin Evangelism, which at the time you were kind of taking a gamble with your time. We just kind of touched base online. You never know when you're talking to somebody online. People could turn out, I could have been a total creepo or total weirdo or been a total waste of time. The book is, when you take the time to read a book, you're giving something of yourself. So that was incredibly generous of you. I'm glad that you found value in it. The book's gone on to that. Bitcoin Evangelism has been the number 2, as high as the number 2 book in the world on Amazon in like several different categories, monetary, inflation. My second book, Parallel, went on to be number 1. I mean, just because the established readership Parallel that I released earlier this year was been number 1 in some of those categories. So thank you. I mean, it's just, yeah, I feel like it's cool on the inside, because when you hear about people that put something out there, whether it was a podcast or they wrote a book and it went on to be a bestseller, you don't really know what the process looks like. I feel very blessed to see what that, and humbled that I got to be a part of that, of something bringing to fruition. And it was what's so humbling about it though, is you realize that you really don't do it on your own. There's no such thing as a self-made man. We're the culmination, and I'm very much an individualist. I really believe when people say, oh, there's no self-made man, you could take a very like liberal approach to that, or you could take a very, yes, I'm an individualist. And I think people are responsible for themselves. But at the same time, you have to be humble to recognize that I don't get off of first base without guys like you lending your credibility and referring the book to people and putting the good word out there. So it doesn't matter how good you think your content is or whatever. Yeah, you don't get off of first base, or you don't even get to first base in this game unless I get guys like Lawrence Dunning that are giving me the shout out and giving me the rub for it. So I just thank you so much, man. It's been really cool to see this process. I've gotten to, and we can talk about it today, I've gotten to go speak to hedge funds, Bitcoin Evangelism. There was a hedge fund earlier this year that bought 200 copies of it. The CEO had read the book himself. It got orange pilled himself. It's just like it was a regular hedge fund. They weren't a Bitcoin hedge fund. They're out of Kansas City. It's the greatest name for a hedge fund ever, called the Redneck Yacht Fund. And they have an official name, but they call it the Redneck Yacht Fund. It's a bunch of Kansas City boys, 3,400 high net worth people. They bought 200 copies for their highest net worth people. That book orange pilled at least 200 of their people. They went on to buy $80 million of Bitcoin earlier this year. And obviously that was earlier this year. So their investment is basically doubled this year already. So it's, again, super cool to see, man. I started out by writing the last bull run in 2021. You have, and just like I'm sure you're getting right now, you have so many people texting you and calling you. Hey, Lawrence, I know you're the Bitcoin guy. Explain Bitcoin to me in a text message or explain it in an email. It's hard to do that in a short format. And so I just started writing a 5-page PDF to like the frequently asked questions. It was just for my friends, for people that were reaching out. Hey, how do I learn about Bitcoin? That turned into a 10-page PDF. Once I got to 10 pages, I'm like, I think there's a lot more here. So that turned into the book. So it was really a labor of love. There was no intention of making money or orange pilling hedge funds. I went to Washington, D.C. last year. We went to the Capitol. We delivered copies of it to senators and congressmen. So it's been on a ride, man. And again, thank you for you're an early adopter of Bitcoin, but you're an early adopter of the book. So thank you.
Oh, my pleasure, brother. And for the people that don't know, I mean, you're a successful entrepreneur. So it's not like your whole life is Bitcoin, but you're just so passionate about it. I think from the same reason that I became passionate about it, there's two people that I think are attracted to, I guess, Bitcoin and crypto in general. There's the ones that see it as this dropless like idea of freedom for the people. And it's hard for us in the US to understand that. But if you're in these countries where they have double-digit inflation and there's no way for them to secure their wealth from this year to the next year without losing so much of it, these assets are an option. Or if they're transferring money with insane bank fees and things like that. So this idea of freedom, that really was why I was attracted to it. And then there's the people that just see, hey, it's going up and to the right and I want to make money. And I think we recently were chatting a bit because I did a podcast with someone where his philosophy was a bit more about the cycles. So the cycle is once Bitcoin leads the way on another bull run, you have all these other coins, the meme coins, everything that follow. So his kind of a momentum idea of momentum trading the cycles. And for me, I was a professional trader for 10 years. I'm not a professional trader anymore. I'm in my mid-40s. I don't want to live my whole life staring at stock tickers and should I buy and sell now and what's a good entry point. I'm more of a long-term investor. So if you look at the last year, this year, 2024, best performing asset of the year, Bitcoin. If you look at the last decade, best performing asset of the year, Bitcoin. So it's got incredible volatility. And I think a lot of people are still a little bit scared of that, but there's no question. We're living through the revolution right now.
Yeah, no doubt. And I understand why guys would be momentum traders. And if you look back over every bull run cycle that's happened in Bitcoin, there's this 4-year cycle. And yes, the Bitcoin halving happens. Then 6 months later, which is just crazy because we're seeing it again right now. Then 6 months later, Bitcoin price starts to shoot up. And then usually about 6 months after that, you see the altcoins. And then the altcoins, which are like your main altcoins would be Ethereum and Solana and XRP. Those run up about 6 months after Bitcoin. And then a few months after that, you get the really small market cap ones that just go on this crazy parabolic run. And it's because the mentality for the masses is, okay, I'm late to Bitcoin. What's the next thing? Okay, now I realize I'm late to Ethereum. So now what's the next thing? People kind of go down the line. The reason why I think that will be different, and not to say that won't happen to some degree, I think altcoins will probably appreciate to some degree, but I don't think they're going to appreciate or outpace Bitcoin, particularly because of the reason why the bull run's happening. The bull run started to happen this year because of the halving, just the normal 4-year cycle of Bitcoin. But now what is everybody talking about? We're talking about fundamental factors that are outside of the normal cycle. You're talking about BlackRock is the biggest institution in the world. I don't particularly like BlackRock, but they've bought more Bitcoin than virtually any institution or than any institution in the world. And they're massive, and they're not the only ones. BlackRock launched that ETF this year, and it was the most successful ETF launch of all time. That's worth noting. So that in and of itself was something crazy. Now, BlackRock's not buying up Ethereum. BlackRock's not buying XRP. No, those big institutions aren't buying these altcoins, nor will they. I mean, they're doing Bitcoin because it's deemed a commodity by regulators. And even if the regulation changes around crypto a little bit, you might get some ETFs popping up here and there, but what you definitely won't get, which is the really big idea here in this bull run, are the sovereign nations that are buying Bitcoin. The United States has had over 200,000 Bitcoin for a long time now, but they've never talked about it because they didn't buy that Bitcoin, as your audience probably knows, that they got it through seizures. They got it through like the Silk Road and things like that. So they held it, but it's funny, the way you frame things is really important. So the US always had 200,000 Bitcoin, which is this crazy amount of Bitcoin. To say that the most powerful nation in the world has 200,000 Bitcoin is huge, but they never talked about it. Now Trump comes along and says, we're going to officially recognize that. It's like having a stepchild that the dad doesn't recognize or something like that. It's like, we don't even, you're not part of the family, but all of a sudden now we're going to recognize that you're part of the family. You're part of the inheritance. And so Trump's saying, not only are we going to recognize that, but we're going to strategically hold that. We're going to protect that. We're not going to sell it, because there was always the risk before that the US, what they did was they would sell some of it when they saw fit, because the price would go up and then the US would say, hey, here's an easy $1 billion. So why wouldn't they do that? Germany did that 4 months ago. Germany had like 20,000 Bitcoins that they got from seizures, and they sold it all. They sold it all at $54,000. They've taken a massive loss on what they could have gained already. Just right now, we're just starting the bull market, and they've already missed out on a 70% gain just because they were short-sighted. The US is taking a different approach. The US, the guys in Trump's cabinet, his new Treasury Secretary personally has over $100 million in Bitcoin. Elon, who doesn't talk about Bitcoin, his company has hundreds of millions of dollars in Bitcoin. Vivek Ramaswamy, big Bitcoin hodler. JD Vance, big Bitcoin holder. Trump, I mean, like these guys, there's RFK, when he was running, was talking about the US acquiring up to 4 million Bitcoin. So they're talking about buying 500 Bitcoin every single day. And if the US does that, every country in the world would do that. And again, that's not going to happen in crypto. This might create some excitement in crypto. People might think they might conflate Bitcoin with crypto in general, but it's really important. It's really important to understand that countries aren't adopting crypto because crypto isn't actually decentralized. I worked in crypto. I worked in blockchain for 3 years. This is before I wrote Bitcoin Evangelism. That was kind of where some of my experience had come from. Crypto is essentially a bunch of centralized entities, and that they have some interesting, cool technology that's being pioneered. But if that technology works, and some of it does, they're building that stuff on Bitcoin. So that's why you're starting to hear about tokens on Bitcoin and things like that. Because ultimately, if you want security and decentralization, you have to go to Bitcoin. Ethereum proved a long time ago that it's not decentralized. In the early days of Ethereum, Ethereum was hacked. There was actually a problem with the code. Somebody hacked Ethereum, and the developers of Ethereum said, okay, well, we're going to roll back. They basically had a time machine on the blockchain. They rolled back the blockchain a little while to basically steal back the funds from the thieves. So it seemed like it was a good idea. But what it proved was they have ultimate control over the blockchain. That's the second biggest blockchain in the world. And Ethereum proved that it is centralized. And so that's a scary thing. If you have $1,000 in Ethereum, not so scary. But if your country is thinking about where you're going to allocate resources in your treasury, you're not going to put it in the hands of Vitalik Buterin and the Ethereum Foundation. You're just not going to do that on a sovereign level. So all of the energy is going into Bitcoin, and there's only 21 million Bitcoin. It's so scarce. It's actually finite. It's more like gold is scarce. Bitcoin is finite. Gold, if the price of gold goes up, you can dig more of it out of the ground to meet the demand. If the price of Bitcoin goes to $100,000, like it's basically doing right now as we're talking, you can't mine more Bitcoin. So countries, that has a balancing act for countries, because if I'm a small country like El Salvador, I actually want the US to get involved, because the US is only going to make the price of Bitcoin go up, but they can't exert more control over the network. So in the terms of game theory, countries can freely adopt it and not have to worry about, if they're not the biggest dog, that they're going to somehow get screwed over by that system. They know that if they own 1% of the Bitcoin, they can't be affected by the guy that owns 99% of the Bitcoin. That's not how it works. And so all that to say, it was a long-winded answer to talk about the economic energy that's coming from the biggest entities around the world, specifically into Bitcoin, not coming into crypto. So if you want to play in crypto, there's nothing wrong with that. Go ahead. Just be aware that it is distinctly different from Bitcoin.
Yeah, so well said. So the idea, I just saw a headline today. I think two things that I noticed that really happened leading up to the election. It was more and more people, like whether it's old Wall Street fund managers and people that maybe a year or two ago would say, I don't want anything to do with Bitcoin, and now suddenly saying, I'm seeing Bitcoin going to $1 million at some point, like incredibly audaciously high price targets for Bitcoin from people that I think traditionally weren't really on board. So that was one thing I noticed. And then of course you mentioned it just now, but I think El Salvador was the first, correct me if I'm wrong, Brian, but the first country to kind of start putting some of their strategic reserves in. Like you said, the US has 200. And then I saw a headline at someone today, I think one of maybe he's running for prime minister in Poland. And he was saying if he gets elected, that's one of the things he's running on is he wants to put some of Poland's strategic reserves in there. And it's just, that would be an absolute game changer. I mean, if, like you said, you have a finite supply and then you have more, as soon as the US starts doing something, so many other countries follow. That's just the nature of it. So this feels like we're on the precipice of something huge.
Yeah. And Bitcoin, because it's scarce, like we talked about, or it's finite, there's only a certain number of them. People underestimate how fast the price of it can rise. We think in terms of stocks and assets like that, how much economic energy can come into those things, like a 5% or even a 20% move would be massive, or that like over the course of a year, maybe 100% on a stock is like this incredible run. What the kind of things that Bitcoin can do are pretty insane. In 2017, when Bitcoin got to $10,000 for the first time, it took however many years, 8 years for it to get to $10,000. It got to $20,000 in 17 days. So after it hit 10,000, it only took another 17 days for it to double to 20,000. So when you have a scarce asset and you have absolute FOMO, now when it went from 10,000 to 20,000, that was only because the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, which probably maybe near and dear to your heart, I know you're over in that neck of the woods, that was on the announcement that they were going to be offering Bitcoin futures. It wasn't even they were going to hold Bitcoin. It was just like, wow, there's a regulatory body that's going to allow Bitcoin to be traded in some capacity on its exchange. That was enough for the world to kind of have FOMO over Bitcoin. Now we're at an entirely different scale. I've heard you mention this before. We mentioned this in Bitcoin Evangelism. There's over 50 million millionaires in the world. And you can Google this. I'm sure that number is changing constantly. But even if you don't consider the billionaires, and if you don't consider the trillion-dollar companies and the quadrillion-dollar nations that are coming to Bitcoin, but if you only consider the 50 million millionaires, there's only 21 million Bitcoin. So not every millionaire can even have an entire Bitcoin. You're not going to having a Bitcoin will be bigger than a bigger status than being a millionaire. If you have 100,000 sats, just 100,000 pieces of Bitcoin, that's going to be a substantial amount of money, and probably not the too distant future. You're probably talking about the next 10 years, 100,000 sats, which is I don't know, what is it, $90 or something like that today. You can get 100,000 sats for $90. That will be substantial money, because you're talking about an asset that only a small fraction, if the entire world adopts this thing, you're only talking about small fractions of Bitcoin being the value of significant amounts of economic energy. So it's so easy to overlook that. It's so easy to think in terms of in this linear logic that we have rather than exponential, which is the way that Bitcoin works. Bitcoin's much more exponential than linear.
Right. Brian, so going back, so we're recording this it's been 2 weeks since the election, something like that. It started running up into the election. I think all asset classes were going up. So it seemed like they were what I heard was there was indications that Trump was going to win because that would be better for a lot of these assets. That's why they were going up into the running of the election. Then we had the election, like you said, so many people around Trump are very pro Bitcoin. Do you think then on top of that, like you said, you have the 4-year cycle. Do you think in a hypothetical world, if Harris had won the election, would Bitcoin be around the 72 or something? Or because all these other things with the big hedge funds adopting it, that's still happening regardless of who's the president. But the policies like the Gary Gensler from the SEC is very against Bitcoin. He's going to be replaced. So I guess how much of the election do you think played into this recent rally?
No, that's a great question. I believe that in the short term, we wouldn't be where we're at if Harris had won the election. I think that there would have maybe been, I think the price would have been higher after the election, just the fact that the election was done, I think that the price would have ticked up a little bit, but it wouldn't have been exciting. It would have been at 73,000 or something like that, which was like the previous all-time high. So it wasn't like there's nothing to be excited about that, but there wouldn't have been kind of this, wow, things are really starting to change. My friends who only get in this group text every 4 years when Bitcoin's ramping up, that text group is just on fire right now. Guys asking questions who haven't asked questions for 4 years. Now that wouldn't be happening if it wasn't for Trump winning right now, because that part of the 4-year cycle shouldn't occur until this time next year. We're actually 1 year ahead of, if anybody's paying attention to the charts right now, this November, December is 1 year early. The mania, if it's just based on the 4-year cycle, is supposed to come 18 months after the halving. And so that would actually be December of 25 is when we should be hitting these new all-time highs, and people, friends calling you that haven't talked to you since high school about asking about Bitcoin. That should all happen next year. So we're way ahead of the schedule. And yes, I think you're exactly right. It's because of Trump creating some excitement. But as you mentioned, BlackRock was still buying before the election. There was a Friday where they bought 14,000 Bitcoin on one day. I mean, that's months of mining supply. They're buying up more than is incoming from Bitcoin. And they're doing it quietly because they're buying it over the counter. They're not buying it on exchanges. I think they don't realize, if anybody that watched the movie There Will Be Blood about the oil tycoons, there's that great line where the bad guy says, I drank your milkshake. He's talking about how he drank the oil, or he basically sucked the oil out of his neighbor's land. He was just next door to it. So his neighbor didn't realize that oil was being sucked out from his land beneath him. That's what's happening right now. The neighbor didn't realize everything on the surface looked the same. There was nothing different, but underneath all of that energy was being taken. The oil was being taken. The Bitcoin is being taken on the backside of things. I know OG Bitcoiners, guys that have been in since the early days of Bitcoin, they're getting calls from over-the-counter exchanges, or OTC desks, as they call it, saying, hey, can you sell us 10 Bitcoin? Can you sell us 20 Bitcoin? We'll pay a 10% premium on the price today, because the over-the-counter. So just so you know, over-the-counter trading is actually trading at a premium. They're doing it because they're willing to pay 20% more for Bitcoin than if they were to go to Coinbase and buy it, because it's better for them. They would be buying up the price so fast that it would actually cost them more than 20% if all of their buy orders were on the exchange. So they do it off the exchange and they pay 20% because they don't want to pay 30% by bumping the price up 30%. So by their last purchases, they'd be paying an extra premium if they were doing it on exchanges. So what does that mean? It means the guys that are trading Bitcoin are losing. They're going to lose out. If you look at any bull cycle, there's about 10 to 20 days of where all of your gains come from. If you miss out on those 10 to 20 days, if you were out of the market, if you were in cash on those days, you miss the upside. So if you miss those 20 days of the bull run, you basically get 0% gain on your Bitcoin. So don't miss those days by trading. Unfortunately, the guys that are doing that on the exchanges, they're making the price look one way, but those coins are going to be in the hands of hodlers pretty soon. And what happens to the price of Bitcoin when there's no Bitcoin left to sell? The price has to go up. I think most Bitcoiners are starting to gravitate towards this idea of every Bitcoin's worth $1 million. So when the going price of Bitcoin's 150,000, how many sellers are there? Very few. Price of Bitcoin's 250,000. How many sellers are there? Very few. More people are starting to price in this idea that Bitcoin is worth $1 million or more. So you can get exceedingly, or an acceleration in the price of Bitcoin, because money's essentially a faith system. If you believe that something's worth more, you don't sell it for less. That's just a fundamental characteristic of humanity. But I'm genuinely interested. I mean, we haven't gotten to talk for a while. What's your take on your question as far as what would have happened if Harris had won? Do you think we'd be in the same spot? Do you think that regulation would be looking different? What do you think, man?
Yeah, I think you were spot on. I think he'll be right around like that low, like the kind of resistance level, 72. And I think it would just take a bit more time. I think it just accelerated the trend. So I actually recorded a podcast with a good friend of mine who's been in a space like you for about 10 years. Shout out to my buddy, Brian. And I said, do you think it could, I think we recorded it 2 days before the election or something, a day before the election. I said, do you think we could be at 100,000 before the end of the year? He said, listen, I think maybe within 12 months, but to get that within 2 months, it's a $1.5 trillion asset class. It takes time to move. You have a lot on the over-the-counter market that still has to get absorbed. So he's saying all these things, and he made me feel a bit silly because I had that, I guess in my head, I was thinking, well, if Trump does get in and if it's a much more pro-Bitcoin environment, then I could see it going up just because I feel like I'd seen, and this is so anecdotal, right? But just literally just seeing all these little headlines coming out about this person who never was pro Bitcoin is suddenly talking about it could be over 1 million. And just, I feel like it's in the air, and it's that lovely quote, there's nothing as strong as an idea that's come. And I feel like that it really has, there's so many people, this election for me was not about Trump versus Harris. It was about Harris was not Harris. She was the establishment. She was the figurehead for the corrupt establishment. And Trump is the figure of the outsider, the disruptor, the person that's going to come and cause chaos in a corrupt system. So for me, it was about, he really was, he's a populist candidate. And I was so happy because I'm a free speech absolutist. So for me, I'm so upset with seeing all the details on free speech and tech censorship and things like that. So I feel like this election was just, it was so important. And it does feel like we're living through some crazy times. And even just that thing with Elon calling the Department of Government Efficiency Doge, it's like the Dogecoin. It's just so funny. I really feel the next few years are going to be really interesting to see how much of this stuff they can do with all both Republican and Democrat, all the senators are a lot of them are corrupt, bought, paid for by lobbyists. So how much can actually get done? I'm very curious. But one thing that I fundamentally disagree with, Brian, is, excuse me, when you look back, and like you said, we have these 4-year cycles. It's clear as day. But eventually that was only when it wasn't adopted by big hedge funds and people like Michael Saylor that are just buying so many. For me, all these buyers out there, it kind of puts a floor on the market. So I don't see us having these incredible pullbacks anymore. The more established the asset class gets, I don't ever see it having these. What was the last one? It went from the high of 69 down to the low of 16 or something. So like these incredible pullbacks. And I think that shakeout, I'd love to ask your opinion. That's why I'm talking to you. I feel like that was a real shakeout of all the shady characters like SBF and these people doing shady things in the crypto space that gives it a bad reputation. But yeah, I just don't ever I see everything cycles, but I see this floor under the market. And I see it under the stock market. I see it under the real estate market. I see it under the crypto market. I just think there's trillions of dollars on the sidelines. And when you're pricing things in US dollars that are just losing their purchasing power every day, and there's a finite amount of assets, like there's a finite amount of real estate, there's a finite amount of Bitcoin, there's a finite amount of gold. I just think that there's going to be people fighting over investing in the same resources, if that makes sense. So I see a lot of upside, and I definitely see pullbacks, but I think they're going to be short-lived and not too drastic. That's the way I see it. But I'd love to just kind of ask your opinion about the cycle thing, because by necessity, the more like these hedge funds that are buying it, they're not like these big swings. I feel like are caused by regular buyers that jump in because it's going parabolic and they're trying to make money, and then they freak out and they sell when it's going down because they're like, I don't want to lose all my money. But when you get the big players, the people that are holding forever, like Michael Saylor's like, I'll be buying the high at Bitcoin forever. He's never going to be selling it. When you have people like that, I just don't see these pullbacks.
Yeah, I think you're right. Well, real quick too, on your Doge comment, I just think it's hilarious because Elon has this theory. He talks about it all the time that because there's Occam's razor, right? Which is the most reasonable answer is probably the most likely. Like that's how conspiracy theorists, we should probably think is, okay, it's not the craziest answer. Elon's working theory is that the most ironic thing is what happens. And is there not a more ironic outcome than this crazy lunatic billionaire guy who he's a lunatic, but at the same time, we all believe that he's a billionaire, but I think he's kind of an outsider. It's not only that, but he's adopted this meme coin as the name of this thing. So it's like this silly aspect, but this silly thing is going to perhaps have the greatest fruit or bear the greatest fruit of any kind of government agency or institution, or what do you want to call it, an advisory board or whatever it is, it might have some of the most profound impact on our government and our governance than anything ever before. And it's a silly name. Like generations from now, they're going to say, well, why did they call it Doge? Because isn't that pronounced dog? Well, there was this coin called Dogecoin, and Elon was really into that. I mean, it's so ironic. But yeah, to your point about the 4-year cycles, I think you're right. I guess that's kind of what I was trying to hint at without saying it, of we're early. If the 4-year cycle was repeating, these things wouldn't be happening until next year. I think that's a sign that this is secular from all of the other 4-year cycles. I mean, and I think that's what we expected. If Bitcoin, for guys like me that are really big proponents of the parallel system, that's how you see new money being adopted. And this is the order of operations. It had to go from like a tchotchke, or kind of a novelty, something that was kind of fun to hold Bitcoin because it was new. And I'm only holding Bitcoin. I mean, the early guys were only holding it because it was novel. There was no value to it. And then maybe there was some value to it. But then it goes from a novelty or a toy to something that is a store of value. And then it goes from a store of value to a medium of exchange. Once it goes from a medium of exchange, then it goes to a unit of account. That's the order of operations. So Bitcoin's really coming along in its store of value phase. People are starting to recognize that. And I agree with you 100%. The 4-year cycle is broken. And I keep calling it, this is the Constantine moment for Bitcoin. If anybody is familiar with like church history, that in the early church, Christ was actually crucified under the Roman government. And then his followers were oppressed for hundreds and hundreds of years. But the church, even though it was oppressed, it hung around, and it actually hung around for long enough so that the conditions were fertile enough so that eventually you have this guy, Constantine, who is the most powerful emperor in the world. This guy adopts Christianity, and in an edict, in a moment, it goes from Rome oppressing the church to it is now the official religion of the biggest empire in the world. And I think that's what we have with Trump here. We have this moment of the US government and China and all these different countries were the very institutions that were oppressing Bitcoin. They were trying to tamp it down. Now, after 16 years, Bitcoin's bigger than ever. Well, Bitcoin's only been facing headwinds from the governments. What happens when Bitcoin has tailwinds from the governments? When the governments are pushing it forward? Yes, I think that's it breaking out of that 4-year cycle. And guess what? I mean, a lot of people, historians, think that Constantine wasn't actually a Christian, that he was just using it as a way to kind of get power over people. That's quite possibly true. The point is, Trump might not actually be a Bitcoiner. He might not actually understand the fundamental tenets of Bitcoin. I actually think he's pretty favorable to it, but I doubt that Trump knows a whole lot about the ins and outs of Bitcoin, but I think he trusts the people around him to understand that this is the way forward. And guess what? Even if Constantine wasn't really a Christian and really didn't believe that, he still changed the face of the world. He changed the face of the Roman Empire by doing that. And I think that's what we have before us is Trump issuing this. He's waving his wand over the approval of Bitcoin, and now everybody's responding to it accordingly. And that's what we have before us. It's a moment in history that I think is going to be looked back on for hundreds and hundreds of years of that's when we went from these weird fiat currencies. Like generations from now, they're not going to understand why we had fiat currencies, like government currencies. Wait, why would people trust in government currencies that could just be printed at will and without the people's knowledge? And why wouldn't you go to a currency that everybody had a copy of the ledger and it was fair and it was open? It's going to seem clear as day that Bitcoin was the solution. And that's how we know that we're early. Like your friends are going to be asking, Lawrence knows this, but the people in the audience, like if you're wondering if you're early or not to Bitcoin, just recognize that 99.9% of people don't know what I just said about that we're early to Bitcoin. 99.9% of people don't know that there's only 21 million Bitcoin. And so that's one of the fundamental tenets of Bitcoin. Are we early? It seems like we're not, because Bitcoin's at $100,000. And so, I don't want to put my money into Bitcoin at this point. People can't even describe why Bitcoin matters. They might be able to tell you the price, but they can't tell you why it matters. And that means we're early. And so, yes, we've broken the 4-year cycle. And yes, I think, like you said, there might be some drawdowns at some point, but how big of a drawdown can there be if governments are holding it in their treasury? Governments aren't going to be trading these assets. El Salvador is not going to be trading these assets. The US isn't going to be going in and out of these assets. I think that the US actually has an opportunity, and Trump has a big enough ego that he has a cheat code in front of him. Historically, governments, their fiat currencies always go to zero because of hyperinflation. And that's the trajectory of the US dollar. As big and as powerful as the US dollar is, the only three options, and we don't have to go into that in depth, but the only option governments ever take 100% of the time is they hyperinflate their currency. That's the only way they can kind of pay off their debt. There's now a fourth option, and the US is the only country that can do it. They could buy Bitcoin with printed US dollars. And guess what happens? When you take 1 billion gallons of water out of the ocean, it doesn't do anything to the level of the ocean because it's such a big pool of water. 1 billion gallons doesn't do anything. And that's the US dollar. Bitcoin is like the community swimming pool. If you put 1 billion gallons of water into the local community swimming pool, water would be everywhere. The neighborhood would be flooded. I mean, it would be overrun. And so I just say that because the US government could print $10 trillion, and that actually wouldn't do that much to the US dollar. But $10 trillion going into Bitcoin would outpace Bitcoin would appreciate at a faster rate than the US dollar would inflate. And so there's a cheat code in front of us. Trump could actually pay off the US debt by buying Bitcoin. It's the only time in history this could ever happen. And I think Trump's crazy enough and self-indulgent enough to want this for his legacy. And I actually think that's the path forward.
That's absolutely wild. That never thought about it, but that makes sense. Brian, I had a first snow and my preschool started early, so I've only got a few minutes, got to pick up my son. But I wanted to ask you, so this isn't a investment advice podcast. This also is for informational purposes only. But I guess for me, I'm telling all my friends, just whatever you have, just put a little bit in Bitcoin. Just give yourself, if you want to be, I've got some friends that 90% of their savings in Bitcoin. I love them. And I got friends that 5%, but just don't be the guy that has hundreds of thousands of dollars of assets and zero Bitcoin. In my opinion, no, that's my friendly advice to my buddies. But the only thing that I'm worried about is the idea of quantum computing and the ability to somehow solve Bitcoin, like the algorithms, and then it could suddenly wake up one morning and say, hey, it's worthless if everyone loses their faith in it. Is that, I don't really understand quantum computing. I'm not an engineer, but is that a possible risk? I was just trying to think about the possible risk for Bitcoin.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I'm a part of a team that they have quantum resistant technology for Bitcoin that's in the works. Bitcoin in its current iteration, the cryptography around it is still broad enough and sophisticated enough to even account for quantum computing. So a quantum computer could do what the computers we're on right now. It could do what the computers you and I are on right now. These computers could do in 10,000 years, a quantum computer could do it in a few minutes. So it's the order of magnitude of how much faster quantum computers are is pretty insane. So yes, if Bitcoin is about hashing, then quantum computers would, understand why there's a concern there. But just to understand how insane it is, because you can't hack the Bitcoin protocol because it's not just a singular source code. It's essentially a decentralized network of computers. And let me explain what I mean by that. It's not like your Wells Fargo bank account where they could go into the system and then change some code. And then all of a sudden they have control over that because there's a single point. The Bitcoin network is much more like chess. How would you hack the rules of chess? If I were to go in, if me and Lawrence were to go put a bug into the code of chess, yes, me and Lawrence could create a version of chess that is, the king can move as many spaces as it wants. Pawns can move three spaces on the first turn. Whatever, we could create our own rules. But guess what? Even though we've inserted a bug through quantum computing, it's not inserted across the entire network. So even though you and I have a certain game of chess that me and you like to play, if we ever went to a chess tournament and we tried to play with our set of rules, our bug that we put into there, the chess tournament wouldn't recognize those rules. So decentralized networks are just different than centralized networks. So the way Bitcoin's structured is actually quantum resistant already. But where quantum computing could come in is guessing your 24-word seed phrase. That's actually where, so not for the whole Bitcoin network, it's quantum resistant. Individual wallets could be at stake. And I think that's maybe what you're saying, because you just essentially have to guess those 24 words. Well, just to put in perspective, I just put a video on my YouTube, or it's coming out, I think, in the next couple of days. But to guess a 24-word seed phrase would be like picking one atom out of the entire Earth, and out of the entire galaxy. So if you were to take our entire galaxy and you were to pick one atom, and so quantum computing, it would still take quantum computers dozens and dozens of years to even hack a single Bitcoin wallet. And they would spend all that computer resource to hack a Bitcoin wallet. And there's no guarantee that particular wallet that they finally got into has any Bitcoin. It might be my wallet with $100 of Bitcoin in it, but they spent $1 billion of computing power. So it's not a profitable venture at this point.
What a great answer. Brian, I can't wait to a part 2, maybe after Christmas, because I want to hear about everything else in your life, especially life as a Jiu-Jitsu Blackbelt now. I'm sure it's fun. I hurt my neck yesterday, so I've been paid today. But brother, it's always such a pleasure. Thank you for sharing your wisdom, and I really appreciate you. And I completely forgot. I saw you had your second book, and I completely forgot to get a copy. So I got to get a copy, and maybe we can talk about that next time too. But Brian, thank you for your time. And every time I talk to you, I just think I have a lot of money in real estate projects and things like that. And I'm like, man, I got to buy more Bitcoin. So thank you for the reminder.
And I feel the opposite. I feel like I don't have enough real estate when I see your Instagram. So we'll sharpen one another. All right, man. Thank you so much. Go take care of your family. Love you, brother.
Thank you, brother. Love you too.